Today we're installing the Madjax King XD lift kit designed for the Drive-2 with an independent rear suspension. Included with this kit is the rear cradle subframe and the rear shock goalpost. And for the front, we have the main suspension assembly, 2 new front spindles, 2 new upper A-arms, and 2 new shocks, 2 warning labels, a hardware pack, and thread locking adhesive. First, switch the key to the off position, engage the parking brake, and flip the run tow switch into tow. Lift the cart with a floor jack and support with 2 jack stands under the front frame. Remove front wheel covers with a flathead screwdriver to access the lug nuts. Then, using a 19mm socket, remove the lug nuts and front tires. Temporarily remove the dust caps to access the hub nuts. Remove the front wheel hubs using a 19mm socket. Keep the hubs and nuts for reinstallation later. Remove the tie rod ends from the spindles using a 17mm wrench and socket. Reattach the nut to the tie rod for later use. Repeat these same steps on the driver's side. To remove the front bumper, use a 12mm wrench and socket and take out the 2 bolts that hold on the back brackets, as well as the 2 bolts located under the front bumper. Using a 14mm socket and wrench, remove the upper shock nuts only, leave the bolt in place for now. Using the same tools, remove the lower bolts and nuts from the A-arms at the frame. You can now remove the spindle and shock assembly and keep the hardware for later use. Then repeat this on the passenger side. With the help of an assistant or floor jack, lift the Madjax main suspension up to the frame with the vertical mounting tabs behind the second cross frame section. Secure but don't tighten the suspension to the frame using the supplied 10x35mm bolts and washers included with this kit. Place the supplied U-bolts over the frame tubes to secure the rear section of the suspension. Secure with supplied nuts and washers and hand tighten for now. You can fully tighten the front suspension bolts to the frame using a 17mm socket. Evenly tighten each U-bolt by alternating sides with a 17mm socket. Torque the U-bolts and front frame bolts to 35 foot-pounds each. Install the new upper A-arms with the angled side towards the front of the cart as shown. Secure using the factory bolts from earlier and hand tighten for now. Repeat this on the passenger side. Install the new supplied shocks with the barrel side down to the OEM upper shock mount and secure with the factory hardware. Then attach the lower end of the shock to the A-arm and secure using the supplied 8x60mm bolts and hardware. Repeat this on the driver's side. Tighten the shocks and the A-arms using a 14mm wrench and socket. Torque the shock bolts to 35 foot-pounds and the A-arm bolts to 40 foot-pounds. Attach the new spindles to the upper and lower A-arms using the 10x80mm bolts provided. Attach the lower bolt first and then the upper bolt second. Take note that the steering arm mount point towards the rear of the cart. And then attach the tie rods to the new spindle arms. Secure the spindles and the tie rods using a 17mm socket and wrench. Install the factory hubs to the new spindles and torque the hub nuts to 84 foot-pounds using a 19mm socket. Then replace the dust caps and repeat on the other side. Now is a good time to grease all the fittings on the spindles, lower A-arms, and upper A-arms. If installing a counterweight kit, do so now before the tires go on. Click the link below for that video. Install your new wheels and tires using aftermarket 12mm lug nuts and torque those lug nuts to 65 foot-pounds using a 19mm chrome deep well socket. For the 4-inch lift kit, we recommend using 20-inch tires with 3/4 offset wheels. Do not attempt to adjust the alignment or camber at this time. Moving to the rear, chock the front tires, lift the cart up at the rear, and place jack stands under the frame. Then remove the rear tires and wheels. To access the rear suspension components, you'll need to remove the rear bagwell cover with a 5mm Allen head socket. Remove the QuietTech panels from under the cart as shown to access the independent rear suspension components. Place the jack stand under the rear differential to support it during the rear subframe swap out. Disconnect rear control arms from subframe using 14mm socket and wrench. A pry bar may be needed to free the A-arms from the subframe. Remove the rearmost bolts near the bumper from the subframe using a 14mm socket. There's 4 bolts remaining holding the subframe to the cart. Use caution as the subframe will be free to drop after this next step. Use a 14mm socket and remove these 4 bolts located at the front of the subframe. For carts 2019 and older, you can skip these next few steps. For 2020 and newer carts, first you will need to temporarily remove the driver's side wheel well to access the frame. Then use a straight edge in the cart's frame as a guide. Mark a line along the bracket on both sides to cut. Using a cutting disc and angle grinder, cut the unneeded frame bracket off. Be sure to wear safety glasses. Clean the cut with a sanding flap disc and paint raw metal with a rust-proof satin black paint. Secure rear of new cradle using retained bolts and hand tighten for now. Do not tighten nuts more than a few threads to leave enough play to mount the remaining hardware. Attach the front of the new cradle using the factory hardware. Once all 8 mounting points are secured, then tighten with a 14mm socket. Torque all rear subframe hardware to 35 foot-pounds. For the 2020 and newer carts, reinstall your driver's side wheel well. Attach the rear control arms to the new cradle using the factory hardware. Tighten using a 14mm socket and wrench and torque to 35 foot-pounds. If installing with a rear seat kit, use a 7/16 drill bit and drill through the frame at the rear bolt holes. Moving up to the bagwell area, using a 14mm socket and wrench, remove the upper shock bolts and gently lower the shocks down. Secure goalposts to the shock mounts using the factory hardware. Then secure the factory shocks to the lower end of the goalpost using the supplied 10 by 55 millimeter bolts and hardware. Tighten the supplied bolts with a 17 millimeter wrench and socket, and the factory bolts with a 14 millimeter wrench and socket. Then torque all of these bolts to 35 foot-pounds. Replace your bag well. Install your new wheels and tires using 12 millimeter lug nuts. You can now replace your front QuietTech panel. Note that the rear panel will not be reused due to the larger cradle size. Lower the cart down and torque lug nuts to 65 foot-pounds using a 19 millimeter chrome deep well socket. And then drive it around some so that we can do our camber and alignment adjustments. To adjust your camber, place a carpenter square at the middle of the tire to check. If there is a gap at the top of the tire, that is negative camber. If there is a gap at the bottom, that's positive camber. Our goal is to achieve a zero camber. Temporarily remove your tie rods from the spindles. To adjust, loosen the outer jam nuts of the upper A-arm turnbuckle and turn the turnbuckle in either direction to correct the camber accordingly. Retighten the jam nuts when finished and repeat on both sides. Now you can reattach your tie rods to the spindles. Using a tape measure, find the distance between the center line of the tires on the front side and then again on the rear. The front measurement should be approximately 1/8 inch to 1/4 inch less than the measurement taken at the rear of the tire to achieve a slight positive toe end setting. To adjust the alignment, loosen the jam nut with a 17 millimeter wrench and use a 12 millimeter wrench to adjust the steering rack in or out as needed, and recheck your measurement. Adjust again if necessary. Alternate between each side to make sure that they're adjusted as evenly as possible. Once your alignment is correct, tighten the jam nuts on both steering arms and test drive vehicle. Repeat the camber and toe measurements again. If needed, adjust accordingly and retighten all hardware. You can now reattach your factory bumper using the retained hardware. Place the included warning label in a highly visible area on the vehicle for all users to read before operating the vehicle. We recommend somewhere along the footboard as shown or steering wheel. Use the additional warning label provided to place in view of a well-protected area such as in the battery or motor compartment. You now finish the alignment of the Madjax King XD designed for the Yamaha Drive2 independent rear suspension.